History is not written in ink, but in blood and iron. Its pages are the fields of ravaged kingdoms, its words the cries of the vanquished. In the year of our Lord 1429, the Book of France was closing. Its final chapter was being written by the swords of its oldest enemy, England. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, shrouded in a perpetual twilight of fear. This was France, a kingdom on its knees. For nearly a century, the conflict known as the 100 Years' War had bled the nation dry. It was a war that had outlived generations, a relentless tide of English ambition that had washed over the French countryside, leaving nothing but sorrow in its wake. The war began as a dispute between kings, a tangled web of claims and successions, but it had devolved into a brutal struggle for the very soul of a nation. And France was losing. The 100 Years' War, so far. At every turn, it seemed, the French had been met with catastrophe. At Crécy in 1346, the flower of French chivalry, knights encased in shining steel, charged across a muddy field into a storm of English arrows. The longbow, a weapon of terrifying power and precision, cut them down like wheat. The age of the knight, of glorious cavalry charges, died that day, replaced by a new and brutal form of warfare. A decade later, at Poitiers, history repeated itself, but with a deeper humiliation. The French king himself, John II, was captured and taken to London for ransom. France was a ship without a rudder, drifting in a sea of chaos. But the wound that would not heal, the defeat that entered the very marrow of the French spirit, came in 1415. On the feast day of Saint Crispin, on a field of mud and blood called Agincourt, the young and brilliant English king, Henry V, achieved the impossible. His small, exhausted army of archers and men-at-arms stood against a French force that outnumbered them 5-1. The French nobility, arrogant and certain of victory, charged once more into that relentless storm of arrows. The result was not a battle, it was a slaughter. Thousands of French nobles were killed or captured. An entire generation of leaders was wiped out in a single afternoon. Agincourt broke the will of France. King Henry marched through Normandy, conquering city after city. He was an unstoppable force, a military genius who seemed destined to achieve what no English king had before: to unite the crowns of England and France under his rule. Yet, England's greatest ally was not its longbows nor its formidable king. It was France itself. While the English lion clawed at its borders, the French kingdom was rotting from within. The French king Charles VI was not a leader of men, but a prisoner of his own mind. He was known as Charles the Mad, a tragic figure haunted by terrifying delusions. He would sometimes forget his own name, his family, his title. At times, he refused to be touched, convinced he was made of glass and would shatter into 1,000 pieces. With a mad king on the throne, the powerful nobles of France, the king's own relatives, did not unite to save their country. Instead, they turned on each other, hungry for power. The kingdom split into two warring factions. On one side were the Armagnacs, loyal to the French crown, and the Dauphin Charles. On the other were the Burgundians, led by the powerful Duke of Burgundy, who saw more profit and power in an alliance with the English invaders. Frenchmen now killed Frenchmen in the streets of Paris. The Civil War was a cancer, eating away at the heart of the kingdom, leaving it weak and vulnerable. While the House of France burned, King Henry of England calmly walked in and claimed it for his own. In 1420, with the backing of the Burgundians, he forced the mad King Charles to sign the most humiliating treaty in French history. The Treaty of Troyes was a death sentence for the royal line of France. It declared that the Dauphin Charles, the king's only son, was illegitimate, a bastard with no claim to the throne. The treaty named Henry V of England as the regent of France and the true heir to the French crown. To seal the pact, Henry married the French king's daughter, Catherine. Their son would one day rule both kingdoms. The war, it seemed, was over. England had won. But then, fate, in its infinite cruelty and irony, intervened. Just 2 years later, the great King Henry V, the victor of Agincourt, the conqueror of France, died suddenly from dysentery. A few months later, the tragic Charles the Mad also died, his tormented reign finally over. This left a bewildering power vacuum. In the north, in English-controlled Paris, the infant son of Henry, a baby not yet a year old, was declared King Henry VI of England and France. In the south, the disinherited Dauphin, a timid and uninspiring young man of 19, weakly claimed his own birthright as King Charles VII. He was a king without a kingdom, a leader crippled by doubt, haunted by the rumor of his own illegitimacy. He held a small, impoverished court that drifted from one castle to another in the Loire Valley, the last bastion of a dying cause. A noose tightens on Orléans. By 1428, the English and their Burgundian allies were ready to deliver the final blow. They began to push south, seeking to crush the last remnants of Armagnac resistance. One city stood in their way, a city whose loyalty to the French crown had never wavered. A city that sat on the banks of the mighty Loire River, the strategic dividing line between north and south. A city that, for centuries, had been seen as the key to the heart of France. That city was Orléans. In October of 1428, the English army, confident and battle-hardened, laid siege to the city. Their commander, the Earl of Salisbury, was one of England's most celebrated soldiers. He began a systematic encirclement. His men built massive earthen forts, called bastilles, armed with cannons that bombarded the city walls day and night. The thunder of the guns was a constant, terrifying reminder of the city's impending doom. Inside Orléans, the people were trapped. The city's commander, the brave Jean de Dunois, known as the Bastard of Orléans, led a spirited defense. But they were outnumbered and outmatched. As the months dragged on, the English noose tightened. The last bridge into the city was captured. Food supplies began to dwindle. Hope began to fade. The soldiers on the walls grew weary. The citizens grew hungry, and the winter grew cold. For the English, the capture of Orléans was not a matter of if, but when. And when the city fell, the war would be over. The last major army of the Dauphin would be destroyed, and the English would have a clear, undefended path to the south. The cause of Charles VII would be lost forever. Across the kingdom, what little remained of French morale collapsed. The people felt abandoned by their leaders, and worse, abandoned by their God. They prayed for a miracle, but no miracle came. As the noose around Orléans tightened, it seemed that the final dark chapter of French history was about to be written. The kingdom was on the verge of extinction, but salvation would come, not from a king or a knight, but from a teenage girl. Visions and calling. Far from the world of kings and collapsing kingdoms, in the small village of Domrémy, the fate of France was being forged in the heart of a teenage girl. The village sat on the very edge of the kingdom, a frontier land bordering hostile Burgundian territory. Its people knew the sting of war. They had seen the smoke of burning towns and hidden from raiding parties. They were a people of the earth, accustomed to hardship, sustained by a deep and abiding faith. It was in this world that Joan was born. She was the daughter of a farmer, devout and diligent. She could not read or write, a common fate for a peasant girl of the 15th century. But she possessed an uncommon spirit, an intensity, and a compassion that made her stand out. She was known to give her own bed to weary travelers, and she spent long hours in the village church, lost in prayer. When she was 13 years old, her life of quiet piety was forever changed. While standing in her father's garden, a brilliant, blinding light enveloped her, and out of the light came a voice. It was a voice, she said, of noble and divine character. She believed it was Saint Michael the Archangel, the warrior of God, who had come to her. The visitations continued. Soon she heard the gentle voices of Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret, two of the most revered saints in France. For years, they spoke to her, their presence a source of comfort and a secret she held close to her heart. But as the news from the war grew darker, as the English tightened their grip on the kingdom, the message of her voices became sharper, more focused, and monumentally urgent. They gave her a mission that defied all reason. She, Joan, the peasant girl from Domremy, was commanded to go to France. She was to find the weak and uncrowned Dauphin. She was to lead his armies. She was to drive the English into the sea and see the Dauphin crowned as the one true king of France at the sacred cathedral of Reims. It was an insane, impossible task. A mission for a great nobleman, a seasoned general, not a teenage girl who had never traveled more than a few miles from her home. Yet, in the face of this divine command, Joan felt no fear. Her faith was a shield against all doubt. She did not question how it would be done. She only knew that it must be done. She believed, with every fiber of her being, that she was an instrument of God's will, and this belief armed her with a courage that would soon shake the foundations of two kingdoms. The journey to the king. Her first obstacle was a man of the world, a practical and cynical soldier named Robert de Baudricourt. He was the captain of the royal garrison in the nearby town of Vaucouleurs. To him, the war was a matter of men and money, not miracles. When Joan, accompanied by her uncle, first appeared before him and announced her divine mission, he laughed. He told her uncle to take her home and give her a good thrashing for her fantasies. But Joan was not deterred. She was a force of nature, her conviction an unmovable object. She returned again, her certainty unnerving the hardened captain. She began to attract followers, local people who saw in her a purity and a hope they had long thought lost. She told Baudricourt, "I must be at the king's side. I would rather tear my legs off at the knees than not go." The turning point came when she made a bold prophecy. She declared that the French army had just suffered a terrible defeat near Orléans. Baudricourt scoffed, but days later, a messenger arrived with the grim news. A French supply convoy had been ambushed and destroyed in what would become known as the Battle of the Herrings. Joan had been right. Shaken to his core, and perhaps desperate enough to believe in a miracle, Baudricourt finally relented. He would give her a horse and an escort of 6 men to take her to the Dauphin. The journey to the royal court at Chinon was, in itself, a near impossible feat. It was an 11-day ride of over 300 miles, straight through the heart of enemy territory. For a young woman to travel such a distance was unheard of and incredibly dangerous. To protect herself, Joan cut her hair short like a boy's and donned the simple tunic and hose of a male page. For her 6 companions, this journey was a test of their own faith. They were riding into almost certain death on the word of a teenage girl, yet they followed her. They rode by night and hid by day, crossing rivers, avoiding English patrols, their survival a testament to Joan's leadership and sheer unbendable will. When she finally arrived at the sprawling castle of Chinon, she entered a world of faded grandeur and deep-seated suspicion. The Dauphin Charles was not a king, but a man drowning in doubt. He was surrounded by counselors who whispered of defeat and betrayal. He was haunted by the rumor of his own illegitimacy, a rumor spread by his enemies to poison his claim to the throne. When he heard that a peasant girl claiming to be a messenger from God was at his gates, his first instinct was caution. This could be a trick, a Burgundian plot, or simply the ravings of a madwoman. He decided to put her to the most public of tests. Joan was led into the castle's great hall. It was a cavern of flickering torchlight, filled with hundreds of richly dressed nobles and courtiers, all murmuring, all staring. The Dauphin was not on his throne. Instead, he had disguised himself, dressed plainly, and was hidden somewhere in the crowd. He wanted to see if this girl from a forgotten village could truly see what others could not. Joan walked into that intimidating space, her simple clothes a stark contrast to the silks and velvets around her. Her gaze swept across the sea of cynical, curious faces, and then, without a moment's hesitation, she walked straight to the disguised Charles, knelt before him, and said, "God give you life, gentle Dauphin." The court fell silent. Charles, stunned, tried to deny it. He pointed to another nobleman, more regally dressed, and said, "That is the king." But Joan was not fooled. Her eyes never left his. "In God's name," she said, "it is you and no other. I am Joan the maid, and the King of Heaven has sent me to you with a message that you shall be anointed and crowned in the city of Reims, and you shall be the lieutenant of the King of Heaven, who is the King of France. Armor, banner, and army." In that moment, a flicker of hope was lit in the heart of the timid Dauphin. But the test was not over. Before he could entrust the fate of his kingdom to her, the church had to give its blessing. Joan was sent to the city of Poitiers, where for 3 grueling weeks she was interrogated by a council of the most learned and powerful theologians in France. They were doctors of law, bishops, and abbots, and they questioned her on every aspect of her faith, her visions, her mission. They were looking for any sign of heresy, any crack in her story. They found none. Her simple, direct answers, her unwavering piety, and her sharp wit confounded the educated churchmen. At one point, a friar with a thick regional accent asked her what language her voices spoke. She replied, "A better one than yours." When they asked for a sign, a miracle to prove her claims, she gave them a chillingly confident answer. "I have not come to Poitiers to give signs, but take me to Orléans, and I will show you the sign for which I was sent." Her sincerity was undeniable. The theologians delivered their verdict. They had found nothing but good in her: humility, virginity, devotion, honesty, simplicity. The king, they advised, could and should use her help. The final obstacle was removed. Charles, his faith now solid, made a decision that would change the course of history. He would trust the maiden. He ordered a suit of pure white armor to be forged for her, a symbol of her purity. He granted her a household and a magnificent white warhorse, and he gave her a banner, a beautiful white standard of silk, painted with the names of Jesus and Mary, and an image of God the Father holding the world. With her armor and her banner, Joan rode to join the French army. The soldiers were rough, cynical men, veterans of a long and losing war. They were prone to gambling, drinking, and cursing. But when they saw her, this girl of 17, radiating a serene and absolute confidence, they were awed into silence. They saw her not as a commander, but as a living saint, a sign that after all their suffering, God had finally intervened on their behalf. She transformed the army. She demanded that they give up their swearing and their vices. She expelled the prostitutes who followed the camp. She insisted that the men attend Mass and confess their sins. A demoralized and undisciplined rabble was being forged into an army of faith. They were no longer fighting for a weak and distant Dauphin. They were fighting for God and for the maiden he had sent to lead them. She now rode towards the besieged city of Orléans, a single point of light against an encroaching darkness. No one yet knew that in just 9 days, this girl would change the fate of France forever. Arrival and first attacks. On the evening of April 29th, 1429, a convoy of supply barges sailed up the Loire River, slipping past the English forts under the cover of a timely storm. Aboard one of them was Joan of Arc. She entered the city of Orléans not as a conquering general, but as a quiet figure in the deepening twilight. Yet her arrival was like a bolt of lightning. The people of the city, starved and terrified for over 6 months, poured into the streets. They saw her, this girl of 17 in her brilliant white armor, and they saw a living miracle. They reached out to touch her horse, believing they were in the presence of a saint. The sound of their cheering echoed through the narrow streets, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that had not been heard in Orléans for a very long time. For the first time, the citizens believed they might actually be saved. But while the people celebrated, the veteran commanders of the French army were less certain. Men like Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, were pragmatic and cautious. They had been fighting a brutal, losing war for their entire lives. They saw Joan as a valuable symbol, a mascot to boost the morale of the common soldiers. But they had no intention of letting an uneducated farm girl dictate their military strategy. They planned to play a waiting game, to slowly bring in more supplies and wait for a larger relief army before attempting any serious attack. A conflict was brewing, not with the English, but within the French command tent itself. The seasoned experience of professional soldiers was about to collide with the absolute, unwavering conviction of a girl who spoke to God. The clash came almost immediately. The commanders informed Joan of their cautious plans. She was furious. She told them that her counsel, the counsel of God, was wiser than theirs. Her voices had not told her to wait. They had told her to act. The commanders, still skeptical, tried to manage her. A few days later, they launched a small attack on an English fort without informing her. As the battle raged, Joan was in her quarters, taking a nap. Suddenly, she awoke with a start, as if from a trance, and cried out that French blood was being spilled. She called for her armor and her horse, declaring that she must go and fight. She galloped through the city streets, her banner flying towards the sound of battle. She arrived to find the French forces in a disorganized retreat. Her presence changed everything. The soldiers, seeing her, let out a great cheer and rallied to her side. She reformed their lines and led them in a ferocious counterattack. The English, stunned by this sudden reversal, were driven back. But this was not the main objective. Joan's eyes were on the great eastern fortress of St. Loup. On May 4th, against the better judgment of the commanders, she insisted on a full-scale assault. It was a bloody, hard-fought battle. But the French, inspired by Joan's fearless presence at the very front of the charge. Fought with a righteous fury the English had not encountered in years, the fort of St. Loup was taken. It was a stunning victory, the first major success for the French since the siege began. Its impact was immediate. Joan had proven that she was more than a symbol. She was a warrior, a leader whose instincts were blessed by victory. The victory silenced the skepticism of the generals and ignited the fighting spirit of the army. They were now hers to command, and her next target was the key to the entire siege. The turning point. To the south of the city, the main bridge was protected by a formidable English fortress called Les Tourelles. It was a stone citadel, a bastion of English power that had stood unconquered for months. To free Orléans, Les Tourelles had to fall. On the morning of May 7th, the assault began. It was a brutal, desperate affair. The French had to cross a partially destroyed bridge and a moat, raising their heavy wooden scaling ladders against the high stone walls, all while under a constant, deadly rain of arrows, stones, and cannon fire from the English defenders. Joan was at the forefront, as always, her white banner a beacon of hope amidst the smoke and chaos. She placed the ladder against the wall and began to climb, urging her men on. In that moment, disaster struck. A crossbow bolt, fired from the battlements, slammed into her body with terrific force, piercing her between the neck and shoulder. The steel tip went straight through, emerging 6 inches out of her back. She cried out in pain and fell from the ladder. The English on the walls erupted in cheers. They had hit the witch, the sorceress who had plagued them. Panic began to spread like wildfire through the French ranks. Their divine messenger, their holy savior, had fallen. The attack faltered. The soldiers began to retreat, their courage broken. It seemed the miracle of Orléans was over. But Joan was not finished. She was carried from the battlefield, weeping from the shock and the searing pain. Her soldiers feared the wound was mortal. But Joan, with astonishing strength, reached up and pulled the arrow out with her own hands. To stop the bleeding, she created a simple dressing of olive oil and bacon fat. Then, she did not retreat to a surgeon's tent. She went into a nearby vineyard to be alone, and she prayed. For hours, the French attack stalled. The sun began to set. The commanders, believing the day was lost, prepared to sound the final retreat. But then, a figure appeared from the vineyard. It was Joan. Her wound bandaged, she climbed upon her white warhorse, grabbed her banner, and rode back towards the shattered remnants of her army. The French soldiers, seeing her alive, seeing their maiden return to them when they thought she was dead or dying, let out a collective roar of joy and disbelief. This was no ordinary girl. This was proof. They were witnessing a true miracle. Her return electrified them. It was as if their own souls had been resurrected. Joan raised her banner and gave the order for one final, desperate charge against Les Tourelles. The soldiers, now filled with an unstoppable, righteous fury, surged forward. They swarmed over the walls with a ferocity that the exhausted English defenders could not repel. The fortress of Les Tourelles fell. The English commander, William Glassdale, who had hurled insults at Joan from the battlements, fell into the river during the retreat and drowned, weighed down by his own heavy armor. The battle was won. The siege is broken. The next day, May 8th, was a Sunday. The remaining English forces, their command structure shattered and their morale broken, emerged from their remaining forts. They burned what they could not carry and formed up in a line of battle, expecting a final confrontation in the open field. The French army, with Joan at its head, marched out to meet them. For an hour, the two armies stood facing each other in tense, expectant silence. The English, who had been the masters of every battlefield for a generation, did not move. They had seen what had happened at Les Tourelles. They had seen the maiden who could not be killed. They were no longer fighting men. They were fighting a divine storm. Their will to fight was gone. Slowly, deliberately, the English army broke formation, turned their backs on Orléans, and began the long, humiliating march away. Joan ordered her men not to pursue. It was a Sunday, a day for God. The siege was over. In just 9 days, a teenage girl had achieved what the combined might of the French army had failed to do in over 6 months. She had saved the city of Orléans. The victory was so stunning, so complete, so utterly impossible that it could only be seen as one thing: a true miracle from God. The tide of the 100 Years' War had turned. The aftermath: crowning a king. The victory at Orléans was more than just a military success. It was a profound spiritual and psychological earthquake. It was the spark that reignited the soul of France. For the first time in a generation, the French people had a victory to celebrate. The English aura of invincibility, an idea that had crippled the French spirit for decades, was shattered in just 9 days. Joan of Arc, however, knew that saving Orléans was only the first part of her divine mission. A city had been saved, but a kingdom was still in peril until the Dauphin was crowned. While the king's counselors urged caution, Joan insisted on immediate action. They had to ride the divine wave of victory and press their advantage. What followed was a lightning campaign of breathtaking speed. Joan, now the undisputed spiritual leader of the army, led the revitalized French forces in a whirlwind assault on the English strongholds of the Loire Valley. The town of Jargeau was taken by a frontal assault. The bridge at Meung-sur-Loire was captured. The town of Beaugency surrendered. The French army, so timid just weeks before, was now an unstoppable force. The English, desperate to halt this new French aggression, sent a relief army to confront them. The two forces met on June 18th, near the village of Patay. The English commanders planned to set up their classic defensive position, with their longbowmen protected by a line of sharpened stakes. But the French, now fighting with a new and aggressive confidence, did not give them the chance. The French vanguard charged the moment they saw the English, before the archers could even prepare. The result was a slaughter. The feared English longbowmen were cut down mercilessly. The battle was a catastrophe for the English, a victory so total for the French that it became known as France's Agincourt. With the English field army destroyed, the path to Reims was open. The march was a bold and audacious procession, and towns that had been held by the English for years now opened their gates without a fight. On July 17th, 1429, less than 3 months after her victory at Orléans, Joan of Arc stood in the magnificent Reims Cathedral as Charles VII was anointed with holy oil and crowned King of France. She had kept her promise. The Maid of Orléans legacy. The coronation was the true turning point of the war. It legitimized Charles VII as the one true king in the eyes of his people and in the eyes of God. It united the fractured kingdom behind a single sacred cause. The momentum was now entirely with the French. The war would drag on for another 22 years, a long and bloody struggle to reclaim the rest of the kingdom. But its final outcome was no longer in any serious doubt. The tide had been turned at Orléans, and it was now an unstoppable flood that would, in time, wash the English from the shores of France for good. Joan's own story, however, would end in tragedy. She would continue to fight for her king, but the cautious and scheming royal court began to see her as a political liability. In 1430, she was captured in battle by Burgundian soldiers. King Charles, the man she had placed on the throne, made no attempt to ransom or rescue her. She was sold to the English, who were determined to destroy the source of France's newfound spirit. They put her on trial for heresy, orchestrated by a corrupt church court of French clerics who sympathized with the English cause. The trial was a sham, a political assassination disguised as a legal proceeding. For months, she was interrogated, bullied, and threatened. They tried to trap the uneducated girl in complex theological arguments, but she answered with a simple wit and a profound faith that often left her accusers speechless. In the end, they condemned her as a heretic, a witch, a blasphemer. On May 30th, 1431, in the marketplace of Rouen, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. She was just 19 years old. As the flames rose, she repeatedly cried out the name of Jesus. An English soldier, watching the horrific scene, was heard to say, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." Her martyrdom only made her legend more powerful. 25 years later, the king she had made, having finally driven the English out of France, launched an investigation that officially overturned her conviction. She was declared an innocent martyr and eventually a saint. But it all began in those 9 days of glory. The Siege of Orléans was Joan of Arc's 9 days of glory. 9 days that turned despair into hope and changed the tide of the 100 Years' War forever.